On YouTube, I see a lot of arguments for a high protein diet. So in this video, I want to explain a perspective for why a low protein diet may be optimal for long-term health. So what actually extends the lifespan of multiple animal species? And I'm not talking about an intervention that changes a biomarker. I'm talking about what simply leads to animals living longer. Well, some of the longest lived mice that have ever been created were created by mutating the IGF-1 receptor. Also, we know smaller dogs, for example Chihuahuas, live longer than larger dogs. That's because they have reduced insulin-like growth factor and growth hormone. And we also know ponies, small horses, live longer than large horses. So there's a lot of evidence that low IGF leads to extended lifespan. We also know calorie restriction extends lifespan, not fasting. Rather, it's calorie restriction. Simply reducing the calorie intake in one's lifetime leads to extended lifespan. And we also know rapamycin. This medication is the gold standard for extending lifespan in multiple animal models. So why do all of these interventions increase lifespan? It's because they all inhibit mTOR, a large protein complex in virtually all cells in the body. So therefore, if you were to activate mTOR, you should theoretically shorten lifespan. For example, in obesity, lipids start to develop outside of adipocytes. For example, in obesity, lipids start to develop in liver cells, which leads to lipid metabolites that upregulate gluconeogenesis, which upregulate blood glucose and insulin, and high insulin activates mTOR. And also in obesity, lipids start to develop in skeletal muscle, which makes the skeletal muscle insulin resistant, which also leads to increased insulin, which activates mTOR. We also know high growth hormone and IGF-1 also activate mTOR. And lastly, we know protein, specifically the branched chain amino acids high in certain meat products, and methionine and other amino acids also activate mTOR. And the way you should think about it is insulin and IGF-1 partially activates mTOR, but then when you also add protein, then you get full activation of mTOR. And keep in mind, rapamycin, the gold standard for extending lifespan in virtually all animals, inhibit mTOR, while protein does the literal opposite. It activates mTOR. So why exactly does inhibiting mTOR extend lifespan? Well, when you inhibit mTOR, you upregulate cellular repair programs. For example, you promote proteostasis, which maintains the integrity of proteins in the cell. You upregulate autophagy, which recycles worn-out organelles. It's essentially like a spring cleaning, which finds the damaged parts of the cell, breaks it down, and then repairs it. You upregulate mitochondrial health and mitochondrial biogenesis, and you also indirectly upregulate DNA repair systems. However, I have a different theory. I believe when you activate mTOR, you're essentially activating a motor that regulates the growth through life. So when I think of mTOR, I think of a motor. And essentially, when you activate this motor, you grow through life. You begin as a newborn, then you go through a thing called puberty, then you become an adult, then some of us go through menopause, then you eventually die. So I believe when you activate mTOR, you're accelerating progression through this growth and accelerating the rate of aging. So what exactly do I mean? Well, when you activate mTOR, you promote growth and cell division. You essentially promote stem cells from dividing to form somatic cells, and then you activate mTOR and you promote growth and cell division. And we know every time you divide, telomeres shorten. So if you're constantly activating mTOR, you're activating cell growth and cell division, where telomeres get shorter and shorter and shorter, and eventually when telomeres are so short, the cells essentially become senescent. And these senescent cells are non-dividing cells that just accumulate damage. So therefore, if you're constantly activating mTOR, you're burning through your stem cells, and accelerating the onset of the accumulation of these senescent cells, these post-mitotic, non-dividing senescent cells that just accumulate damage. So if you constantly activate mTOR, you're accelerating the onset of age-related diseases. However, if you're inhibiting mTOR and you have very low mTOR activity, you're going to rate limit this process. You're going to rate limit and slow the process of burning through these stem cells and slowing the process of cell growth and cell division and slowing the onset of the accumulation of these senescent cells and this age-related phenotype where you accumulate these non-dividing senescent cells that just accumulate damage and lead to tissue deterioration. Also, if you have a precancerous cell that has accumulated DNA damage, you want this precancerous cell to activate apoptosis to get rid of it. However, if you're constantly activating mTOR, you're inhibiting the activation of apoptosis. For example, if you're constantly activating mTOR, you inhibit caspase 9, inhibit the release of cytochrome C, inhibit Bax and Bax from activating apoptosis. So therefore, if you right now have a precancerous cell, you want that cell to activate apoptosis. But if you're constantly activating mTOR, you're going to prevent apoptosis and you're going to enable this precancerous cell to continue to grow, divide, and accumulate more DNA mutations until it eventually becomes cancerous. And I believe this is why the Laron syndrome dwarves in Ecuador are essentially immune to cancer. They have extremely low cancer rates. And I believe it's because in Laron syndrome, you have very low IGF-1 activity. So therefore, you have very low mTOR activity. So you're allowing these cells to sense DNA damage and readily activate apoptosis in response to DNA damage. So therefore, whenever you develop a precancerous cell, you readily activate apoptosis and get rid of it. And I believe that's why they have such a low cancer incidence. So red meat is high in heme iron. Why is that an issue? Well, our mitochondria are constantly producing reactive oxygen species. However, fortunately, we've evolved gene pathways to quickly get rid of those reactive oxygen species and neutralize them as water. However, iron takes hydrogen peroxide and converts it into the hydroxyl radical. And we have no systems to take care of this hydroxyl radical. And then this hydroxyl radical causes DNA damage and increases the onset of cellular senescence. So therefore, theoretically, too much heme iron should accelerate the onset of forming senescent cells. And it's important to note there's a balance because too low iron causes clinical symptoms, so there's a balance. Also, theoretically, if you were to eat primarily plants, then you would have low vitamin B12 levels. And if you have restricted vitamin B12, that should rate limit DNA replication and therefore cell division. So if you had restricted vitamin B12, that should theoretically slow the rate of cell division and the onset of accumulating senescent cells. And again, you don't want vitamin B12 deficiency because that causes symptoms, clinical symptoms. However, I do believe there's an optimal level of B12 where you rate limit progression through this cellular growth. And also theoretically, low B12 should rate limit the methylation process, and we know these methylation aging clocks are all the rage right now for longevity. So theoretically, low vitamin B12 should rate limit progression through these methylation aging clocks and theoretically may extend lifespan. But again, quality of life matters, and you don't want deficient vitamin B12. I just believe there's an optimal range. Also, deficient B12 we know can increase homocysteine, which may increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. And highly deficient B12 can cause clinical manifestations like neuropathy and other symptoms, so I do believe there is a balance. And I don't want to overemphasize this methylation aging clock because really these methylation aging clocks are just finding correlations between lifespan and the methylation status of the genome. So I don't want to put too much emphasis. However, theoretically, if these methylation clocks are coordinating the expression of genes that progress aging through life, then theoretically restricted optimal B12 may rate limit progression through this methylation agent clock. So this is the most important part of the video. So if you eat high protein, that should activate mTOR and again activate growth in all cells. However, high protein also activates mTOR in skeletal muscle, which should promote skeletal muscle hypertrophy and high skeletal muscle mass. So theoretically, that should be good, right? Well, we know too much skeletal muscle mass is actually associated with increased mortality. And also very low muscle mass is also associated with increased mortality. So therefore, there's a balance. You want the right balance of skeletal muscle. However, when it comes to fat and adipose tissue, the more fat mass, the more mortality. And this is essentially because it's more insulin resistant. So the more fat mass, the more insulin resistant, the more insulin and the more mTOR. So something very important to clarify. So exercise does activate mTOR, but only in skeletal muscle cells. And we know skeletal muscle cells are post-mitotic, non-dividing cells that do not become cancerous. When was the last time you heard of your aunt getting skeletal muscle cancer? That does not happen because skeletal muscle cells are post-mitotic and non-dividing. So therefore, some people argue that activating mTOR with exercise should cause cancer, but that's nonsense because exercise only activates mTOR in skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle cells don't become cancerous because they're non-dividing. However, if you regularly exercise, that does promote skeletal muscle hypertrophy. And remember, skeletal muscle is a glucose sink. The more skeletal muscle you have, the lower blood glucose. The lower blood glucose, the lower blood insulin, and the lower blood insulin, the lower mTOR activity in all cells in the body. Because remember, insulin is in the blood and activates mTOR in virtually every cell in the body. So therefore, if you're exercising, you should have more skeletal muscle, lower blood glucose, lower insulin, and lower mTOR in virtually all cells in the body. And that's one of the reasons why exercise is so good for health and longevity. So I think this is the problem. We know muscle mass is associated with longevity. So people assume that high protein increases muscle mass, so that should cause longevity. But I do not believe that's true. I believe it's the exercise that increases muscle mass, which is why muscle mass is associated with longevity. And then protein steals the credit for causing longevity, but I simply do not believe that's true. I believe it's the exercise that's promoting the longevity. And I'm sorry, but I believe there's a ton of evidence that high protein diet might actually shorten lifespan, from animal studies to the biochemistry mechanisms of mTOR. And we also know some of the longest lived communities in these blue zones eat primarily plant-based diets. So therefore, we know with certainty that a high plant-based diet can lead to a long, healthy life. However, we don't have human data on the carnivore diet or keto diet. We don't have long-term population data, so therefore it would be terribly irresponsible to recommend these high-protein keto carnivore diets. And some might argue that long-term age-related chronic diseases need decades-long chronic data analysis, aka epidemiology, and the epidemiology screams that high-protein diet might actually be associated with a shorter lifespan and increased onset of age-related diseases. And I believe that's why virtually every medical association recommends a balanced diet of primarily plants while maintaining regular exercise and avoiding obesity. I don't believe it's a conspiracy theory. I think this is genuinely the honest, the most responsible recommendations if you want to give very safe recommendations of things that you know with certainty can lead to a long, healthy life. And something to consider. Next time you hear about the benefits of red light therapy or stem cell injections, NAD boosters, electromagnetic, whatever, something to think about is ask yourself, have these interventions been proven to extend the lifespan of normal, healthy animal models, not animals with tortured environmental or genetic manipulations designed to benefit from the intervention? Rather, normal animal models has this intervention been proven to extend longevity, not change a biomarker, but actually extend longevity. I could say that cigarette smoking leads to weight loss. Does that mean you should smoke cigarettes? Of course not. You want to look at the totality of evidence and the long-term evidence proving that this intervention actually improves lifespan. So always look for a high standard of evidence before testing an intervention on your own body. And also, something that's really important is maybe an intervention helps your quality of life, or maybe a diet improves your quality of life. That matters, and that's a completely different conversation. Quality of life absolutely matters, but just some things to consider when you hear wild health claims. Just look through some of the data to see, does this actually improve lifespan? Does high iron, is it associated with good outcomes? And look at different diet long-term data. So one potential caveat is the elderly, because we know the elderly has compromised wound healing, immune function, lean mass, and perhaps even brain function. So theoretically, you want high mTOR activity to help compensate for these compromised systems in the elderly. However, if you're a young, healthy patient where you do not have any compromised systems, then I do believe that chronic activation of mTOR will accelerate the onset of becoming elderly and expressing this age-associated phenotype. So one thing I want to emphasize, I'm not a vegan, I'm not vegetarian, I regularly eat meat. I just want to give a perspective and the other side of the argument that I rarely hear on YouTube. And there are others who are much smarter, much more knowledgeable than me, who have a completely different interpretation of the data and may recommend high meat, high protein diet. And those people genuinely care about you and they want to help people thrive and live with an optimal quality of life. So again, I don't know everything, and I'm just making my own interpretations of my understanding of the data. And really the purpose of this video was not to give health advice, but just to give a different perspective and side of the argument to help build a foundation to then do your own research, your own data interpretation to come up with your own conclusions.